Alan Chao is an interaction designer in New York, currently a senior UX designer at Storefront, creating tech-enabled value for an outdated industry. His expertise resides in bridging the gap between humans and emerging technology to create value for digital products. He is the host of the XR Industry Meetup in AltspaceVR, bringing together experts and enthusiasts with the UX and XR industries. He is also the designer and builder of many of the most popular social and event spaces in AltspaceVR. Before I bring him out, though, I just want to mention one thing. There is a known problem with Quest and Go. So if you're wearing those devices, the screen behind me may go black, gray, or white at some point during the talk, in which case you should re-enter the room, and that usually fixes the problem. To re-enter the room, you go to your menu, click on the triangle. That will take you to the big menu. Go to Settings, General, and there's a button in there that says Re-enter Space. Okay, and you're going to be muted for the rest of this thing, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. And now, here's Alan.
All right, cool. Thank you for that very official sounding intro. I wasn't quite expecting that. But anyways, yeah, so thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Alan Chao. Yeah, it was, I think I'm pretty happy to be speaking at the Educators in VR. I think I was here actually at the first meetup, so it's great to see how it's been, how it has grown over the year. Yeah, so like the intro already mentioned, I'm an interaction designer in New York. Actually not at Storefront anymore, but that's not a bad thing. But yeah, I have a background working in 3D tech, the 3D tech space, and at startups as well. And over the last year, or a little over a year, I've also been a VR creator here in Altspace. And I've been creating virtual environments or worlds in Altspace. And also, like mentioned in the little introduction, I'm happy to say that some of them are actually kind of some of them are the most popular, or close to most popular in Altspace. So because I have a background in interaction design and UX, I look at world building kind of from the perspective of the user. So really each world teaches me a new lesson about like spatial design and how to approach world building. And this talk that I'm going to give today is really like a high level version of a series of articles I'm writing on Medium. Part one is already out. It's called Don't Get Stuck in the Hot Tub, Observing User Behavior in VR Environments. I'm going to be covering kind of parts 1 to 3, kind of, I guess. It's all kind of a work in progress, but part one is already on Medium. You can definitely check me out on Twitter. You'll see that later, and you can get a link to that. Or you can actually just Google Don't Get Stuck in the Hot Tub. Let's see. So, yeah. I'm actually relatively new to VR in general. I only got my first headset a little over a year ago, and it was just an Oculus Go. I wasn't even, like an early Rift user or anything, but I kind of argue that, my interest in XR spans probably over 10 years, actually. And I say that because, in 2009, I bought one of these things, which is a 3D printed sculpture. This is a sculpture called Vornado by Bathsheba Grossman. You should definitely Google her. She's an amazing mathematician. But I logged onto shapeways.com, and I found that was kind of the time where 3D printing started to get more accessible. So I found this sculpture on shapeways.com, and I was always just very intrigued by 3D printing and just rapid prototyping in general. The ability to design something and then to kind of hold it in your hands is pretty interesting to me. So yeah, a few days later after I purchased it, I remember unboxing it and taking the bubble wrap off and feeling the spikes in my hand and kind of squeezing it and feeling the texture of the plastic. And it's kind of hard to describe the moment that I or anybody holds a 3D printed object for the first time, because for some reason it's not really that moment that you actually touch it, that you realize that it kind of hits you. Like just a few days ago, this was just an idea. It was just a representation on a screen. Or maybe just even in someone's head. But through the process of 3D printing, it actually turned into something that I can actually hold. And, I definitely thought it was kind of a magical moment, and that's in general people think that it's a magical technology. Well, kind of fast forward to 2015, I actually became interaction designer at Shapeways, and I was there for 3 years. And again, I saw people experience the magic of 3D printing, and really that magic is kind of taking an idea and making it kind of real or real-ish, right? So I kind of argue that 3D printing is actually mixed reality in some way, because if you have a 3D model of a bone, let's say, and you get it 3D printed, well, it's still just the idea of a bone represented in plastic. Like, it was never alive, obviously, and most likely it's not printed out of calcium. So, it's nonetheless, it kind of feels real though, and it feels you can get, once you actually have it in your hands, it makes it intuitive for people to actually understand it spatially, the same way that VR does. So, going back to my first headset, the Oculus Go, probably within the first week, I discovered AltspaceVR, and I got super excited because I realized that I could actually bring my own content into AltspaceVR. And that was a lot like what I was doing at Shapeways, not only because I was an employee, but I really loved 3D printing. I was always 3D printing stuff even at home on my desktop FDM printer. So yeah, that got me super excited for bringing my own content into AltspaceVR, and that's kind of how it started. So my first world was just was actually a really badly made Starbucks. I think I was kind of inspired because I was going around AltSpace, and I actually saw someone had made a KFC, and for some reason that idea of a KFC in AltSpace just was hilarious to me because it's such a mundane, like, everyday thing that that is like using cutting technology to represent. So I thought, well, why not bring a Starbucks into AltSpace? So I went into SketchUp, and I just kind of created a really quick model. You can see it's kind of boxy, not very well modeled inside either, but it had the basics. It had a cash register, the counter. I made sure to include things like, the pastry case, and of course, like, cake pops, because people like those, and some other props. Oh, and also I painstakingly spent time designing a little condiment bar, and the little bins with the 4 different types of sugar in there. I made sure to incorporate those, and people actually noticed, surprisingly. But yeah, once I brought people from the campfire into this space, I was actually pretty surprised because people started role-playing almost immediately. People got behind the counter and started taking orders, and people started queuing up and making really ridiculous drink orders that were just really, really long and impossible to make, essentially. And there were even kind of like mock arguments about, like dissatisfied customers, like, throwing their drink down or whatever. And somehow through the process, I also was named the store manager. Don't know how that happened, but it did. So that was the first. The second, and I tend to kind of do the opposite of, like, I do one thing, and then I do the complete opposite. But this is CubeSpace. It's a really abstract space. It's over 20,000 little yellow cubes, about 2 inches in diameter, kind of just arranged in a matrix kind of form. But that's it. Well, that's not true. There's also kind of an ambient track playing in the background as well. But besides that, it was a very abstract space. And what was interesting about this is, people would either come in and they would get really confused and leave, or they would actually stay around and actually explore. If you turn on flying in the space and move around, you can kind of see the patterns that are forming, but they're constantly changing as you fly. So it's actually kind of meditative in a way. But what I thought was really interesting is when maybe half a dozen or more people got into the space, they actually start to kind of create their own mythologies around what they saw. I think they're kind of inspired by kind of the mysterious factor of just like this abstractness and like the music and all of that. And they started to just kind of, say things and form these like little impromptu cults. They'd be like, oh, like, you must follow the way of the cube, you have to join us. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, this kind of reminded me about Noguchi's idea of non-directive play. So Isamu Noguchi, just quickly, is a Japanese-American sculptor who's pretty famous. you should definitely look up his work if you're not familiar. But he had this idea of that he called non-directive play that he applied to playground designs. So instead of your typical playground with like a swing set and jungle gym, he created these really abstract forms out of earth, essentially. It was basically just the structure of the ground kind of looked like this. Then this is kind of like an architectural scale model, and you can kind of see the little ridges. You can see the little ridges are actually stairs, and maybe the thing in the middle to the right of the little steps are maybe that's like a slide or something. But what's interesting is that this kind of forces the user, or in this case kids, to really just use their imagination. It's not really telling you how to use something, and it's really forcing you to make up your own story, just like how CubeSpace made people think. So if you kind of compare these two side by side, what I learned from Starbucks was that, a simple thing like Starbucks, even though it wasn't really well designed, it kind of preloads a set of expectations and pretty much a set of expectations and instructions for how people should behave in a space. But with CubeSpace, you have the opposite. I basically just created a feeling, and that set the stage for people to interpret it however they wanted. Alrighty, I know I'm moving fast, but I have a lot to get through. So the next world I created just about a little over a year ago was my Brooklyn rooftop space. So I live in New York City, but a little over a year ago, I was actually living in upstate New York for a period of time, taking a break from the city. But I started to kind of miss the liveliness of New York City. There's this ever-present buzz or energy, and it's never completely quiet, like even in the middle of the night. And there's like a grunginess and darkness that that I actually find pretty beautiful, because New York isn't pristine. It's not perfect. And the way I see it, it's both like the good and the bad at the same time. So I really wanted to kind of recreate that feeling in AltspaceVR, and there's actually a socializing aspect as well. Being out in upstate New York, I'm pretty isolated, so I felt the need to connect with people as well. So I wanted to create like a social space. Let me see. Okay, so around the time that I created that space, AltspaceVR was very different. About 14 months ago, this is what the campfire looked like, and a lot of places kind of look like this. They're a little bit dark, just kind of this low poly, very simply styled kind of look, right? But despite that, I actually really like the old campfire. I actually remember standing under, kind of behind where this picture was taken. There's a bunch of trees, and I kind of remember standing under those trees. These were kind of dark, and to me, it kind of felt safe. But I remember just standing there listening to the insects, because when you spawn into the space, you immediately recognize the sound of crickets, and to me, that was pretty relaxing, actually. So despite the fact that AltSpace in general looked very different back then, I still really liked the campfire because of it actually made me feel something. So I kind of want to do that with my Brooklyn rooftop space. I went for kind of a hipster beer garden look, even though I actually kind of hate beer gardens, because it's very hipstery and not it's very hip, but anyways, you get the idea. Yeah, it was a nice setting, but I still wanted to kind of communicate the darkness and grunginess of New York. So it's a nighttime setting. There's actually a street level, which is really dark, but it's funny. I think it's kind of beautiful, and New Yorkers are like, oh yeah, this feels like home. And then other people are like, this is actually a little bit scary. I'm going to get mugged. But I'm like, isn't that great? But yeah, sure enough, I was happy to see that people actually wanted to hang out here. I created many little areas, little nooks, safe nooks for people to kind of hang out, a few campfires, yeah, let's see. Okay, I'm just going through a few images of the space. But yeah, something that I heard pretty early on, after I guess the first iteration of it, was it was basically like 2 a.m. I couldn't fall asleep, so I saw that there were actually people in the space, so I came in, and it was funny. People were actually all in the hot tub, actually drinking beers in real life. And one woman was saying like, hey, like, isn't this great? Like, we're separated by thousands of miles, but here we all are having a beer together. And she said, she had a quote, she just said this out loud, but she's like, real world vibes in a virtual one. And that really stuck with me. That really, I think that kind of summed up what I wanted to represent in that space. And it kind of became almost one of the guiding principles in my design philosophy. Alrighty, so Zen Garden. So this is a photo that I took at my maternal grandfather's Japanese garden in Taiwan in 2006. It was about a year after my grandfather passed away that my mom and I visited Taiwan to visit some relatives. And I wasn't really close to my grandparents growing up because they lived in Taiwan and I grew up in New York. But besides, sorry. I wasn't very close to my grandparents growing up, but during this visit, I stayed in my grandfather's apartment, and which was mostly untouched actually since he had passed. So suddenly I was surrounded by all of his belongings, and I sat at his desk, and I saw like a little cup of pencils and stuff like that, and his glasses were still in there, like the one arm in the cup and the frames hanging out, and I just remember seeing those glasses and just thinking about all the photographs I saw of him wearing those glasses. And yeah, like it's interesting. Because I was surrounded by his belongings, I felt this connection with him, even though he had passed away. But one of his creations that I guess he also left was this garden. It was actually on the roof of a building, of this building that a lot of my relatives live in. But most of it is actually a vegetable garden, and it's which my grandfather also planted originally, and it was still going. But the other thing was this beautiful little Zen garden, or Japanese garden, with like a little path. And I just have these really strong memories, or these really vivid memories of being in that space at nighttime as well. And yeah, that was just it was a memory that I held on to. And yeah, it wasn't until recently that it kind of hit me that this space is a space that he created for his loved ones, and it had actually outlived him. And years later, the memory of it was still kind of fresh in my mind. So I really wanted to create my own space that kind of paid homage to my Taiwanese heritage, but also my grandfather. So this is the space that I created in Altspace. It kind of focuses around a tea house because my family has actually been growing tea for over 30 years on farmland that's been in the family for many, many decades, I think since the 30s technically. And there's also, of course, a little garden and a little koi pond with little koi in there that swim around, and fireflies. So yeah, this was one of the spaces that kind of came out of that. Out of that memory, and it is a small space, but I kind of say that it's memory sized. It's not really trying to be anything more than just a representation of those memories and how I felt. There are even it's kind of an excuse to have details like the tatami mats in there. If you know anything about Taiwan, Taiwan was occupied by the Japanese for 50 years up until 1945, I believe. So that was kind of, my grandparents were alive during that time, and they thought of themselves as Japanese for at least part of their life. But yeah, that rubs off on Taiwanese culture in general. So in people's homes, there are tatami mats. There's like areas that look a little bit like the tea house dedicated to drinking tea. And I have memories of sitting on a tatami mat and the smell of like the hay or grass or whatever that it's made out of. All those sensations are actually very vivid in my mind. But an interesting lesson or an interesting thing that I saw happen in this space, because it is a small space, is that people really see it as an intimate space. If you, in this photograph, or in the screenshot, you can see just beyond I guess the darkest part of the opening out in the distance, there's basically a wall back there. So like from this bond point, you can basically see the back of the space. And it is very small. So this kind of ended up with, I kind of saw two types of behavior here. One is that people felt safe in this space. People felt like it was relaxing. So I found that naturally it became a space for people to have deeper conversations. I found that, I even found myself talking to my friends and kind of opening up. But at the same time, the interesting thing is it's an interesting exercise in seeing the limits of personal space, because maybe after I found after 5 or even 8 people, it felt really, really crowded, and I just basically wanted to leave. Another interesting side effect of the small space is that if there is a race, at least 2 people in a space, and you spawn in, very often you feel like you're intruding on somebody's space. I remember one time I came in and there were 2 people talking, and there was one person they were talking about something very personal, and I just immediately just went around the corner and hit my home button because I wanted to leave, because I felt like I was walking in on a deeply, deeply personal conversation. So I kind of, I felt I don't know, that was just really interesting, because I actually panicked. My heart was racing. Yeah, so anyways, that's Zen Garden. So going back, or going from a peaceful environment to a completely chaotic one, during the holiday season of 2018 and 19, we always see a huge influx of users in AltsSpace, and it's always going to be like that, right? For every holiday season. And as VR becomes more accessible, it means that we have a wider range of users. And guess what? A lot of those users are actually kids. So we actually had a lot of kind of a negative reaction, actually, among a lot of the adults in AltsSpace, who kind of saw it as an intrusion of space. The idea of people wanting age-restricted spaces came up, and things like that. It's a valid moderation concern, but honestly, to me, it was kind of I was kind of thinking on a higher level. We're in virtual reality right now. Why are we running out of spaces? It doesn't really make any sense. So it kind of hit me one night. I was actually at my Brooklyn rooftop space, and I heard a few very young voices, probably kids, who shouldn't be at a bar, role-playing at the bar at my rooftop space, kind of saying "Hey, can I get a Sprite cranberry?" And they're referring to this meme. I had to look it up because I'm 30 years old. But basically AltsSpace doesn't have spaces created for kids. Most of the user-generated spaces are created by adults, for adults, but we don't really necessarily have 13-year-olds using Unity and bringing in their own spaces. Not saying that's impossible. I'm not saying that it's not impossible, but I think that's just not what we're seeing right now. So this is kind of where Meme Island was born. I teamed up with another creator in AltsSpace named Dimmies, who is he's not as active these days, but I worked a lot with him when he was active. And we worked on a space called Meme Island, which was kind of a summer camp inspired space that we were hoping would actually appeal to kids. And it's also done in a low poly style. And we had a zip line that we actually sort of got working for the most part, as long as you continued walking as you went through it. But it actually bring you from the top of the mountain down to where the shore is, which we thought was pretty cool. We had a nice big screen so the kids could actually watch their annoying Pavlov gameplay without bothering the people that just want to listen to music. And they could enjoy a healthy school lunch with burnt chicken nuggets and Tide Pods. Don't eat Tide Pods. And but yeah, as you can kind of imagine, when it comes to a bunch of 13, 14-year-olds in one virtual space on the internet, things can get pretty chaotic. But the reason why we wanted to choose the reason why we chose a summer camp for the theme was kind of borrowing the idea of the Starbucks earlier. Starbucks preloads a set of expectations. So with a summer camp, you have the idea of camp counselors. So Dimmies and I and a good friend of ours became the camp counselors to the space, and we had a code of conduct, which essentially just says "be nice." But that was kind of that was actually a incentive for good behavior, because if you did follow the code of conduct, then you could actually become a moderator, and if you were a moderator, then you have the ability to kick people from the space, as well as access to the video player and and also flight. And we actually had some locations where we had like a watchtower that was only accessible by flight. So we were hoping that that would be an extra incentive for good behavior in the space. And as you can imagine, we chose these ideas because kids are very they're always looking for the authority figure in the room. In their everyday life, among their friends, maybe it's the oldest friend, or maybe they're looking for the parent or the teacher, or in AltsSpace or in online, they're looking for the moderator. So we felt like this was something that would that actually meant something to those users. And yeah, it meant something, and hopefully it was also like a structure that was familiar to them as well. Alrighty. So next, I've been in AltsSpace for over a year now, and especially with the push for events that or the focus on events that AltsSpace is pushing for at the moment, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, how can we actually push the boundaries of what an event can be? And frankly, this format that we have right now is a little bit boring to me, like me standing here with a slide deck. It's great that we can do it. It's amazing that we can do it in VR, actually. But we are in VR, and we can do a lot better, I think. Another thing that I wanted to really focus on was education. Growing up, I had a learning disability. I technically still have a learning disability, and I had an IEP in school. But yeah, I struggled to learn through abstraction in K through 12. But unfortunately, that's kind of like the status quo of teaching these days. I've always thought that like contextual learning made a lot more sense. I think that's probably why I was better at things like science, because I could actually see it. Something that Tom Furness mentioned earlier this week at his talk that I really liked. I really liked the way he articulated it. But he said that VR unlocks spatial memory, and that creates a place in your mind that you probably won't forget very easily. And anyways, I just wanted to mention that because that really stuck with me since Monday. But I think that was a really great way of putting it. So I was kind of racking my brain about something that I could teach. Like, what is something that I have knowledge about that most people don't, and I could actually execute in AltsSpace? So I realized, hey, beekeeping. Beekeeping is something I know about. So yeah, I've been keeping bees since 2015. I'm actually winding down a little bit now, just because it takes a lot of effort. But yeah, beekeeping is something that's interesting to a lot of people, but it's something that people don't really know about. I've had like countless conversations about beekeeping with friends, and they ask every single question that they have about bees, like how many bees are in a beehive? Like, what do bees do in the winter? How much honey do they make? Is it true that there's only one queen in every beehive or in every colony? And soon enough, it would just turn into like a 2-hour conversation about bees, and I actually found it pretty enjoyable. I mean, I got kind of tired of talking, but I was really happy that people were so fascinated by the subject, and I also felt like I probably answered almost every question I could think of about bees. So I want to create an event that was focused around bees and beekeeping in kind of the form of a lesson or like a hands-on workshop. But the thing is, I didn't want to, I took into consideration that we're in VR, kind of like what I just mentioned, and I felt really passionate about that. So I had a really simple rule for myself, which was that I would not have any slides or any type of 2D representation of anything for this lesson. And I kind of just use that as a guiding principle for this event. But of course, that meant I needed to actually 3D model a bunch of assets for the event. So what's interesting about, this is what I created. What's interesting about some of these assets, like the yellow box on the left there, I actually use photographs of my real beekeeping equipment to texture these models. So on an almost personal level, the reason why I actually named it Alan's apiary is that it actually felt like it was really mine. Actually, I'm going to go back 2 slides. So this is the photograph of my beehives the first year I started, and this is a 360 panorama of the property where my bees are actually that I took with my drone that I used for the skybox. But yeah, thinking about that last photo that I just showed, this is what I ended up having in AltsSpace. I actually, I kind of set all this up so that I could actually manipulate all the objects during the event. Let's see, I think there's a video next. Yeah, so I really wanted to communicate the feeling of being at the bee yard and having the bees kind of flying everywhere and the sound of the bees. And there's just this kind of like controlled chaos that I think is just really interesting to experience. And I wanted all those feelings to kind of come across in the event as well. And like I mentioned, during the event, I was able to actually on the fly, manipulate some of these objects and go through my outline of, the basics of beekeeping and hive inspection and all the equipment that I used. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. Oh, actually, no, that's not. I lied. So what I found during the event is that questions actually got pretty interesting. I found that because people were seeing things in person, the questions were very different from the high-level questions that I got just in conversation with friends. A lot of the questions got really specific because people were actually able to see what I was doing. They could see me taking the lid off of the beehive and actually taking the frames out and pointing to the actual frames and saying like, hey, the outer part of the frame means X, Y, Z. So people could actually look at that and say, well, what is that yellow part over there? What does that mean? And I think people were able to actually comprehend the complexity of beekeeping in a way that I just didn't see in any other place because they actually were able to see things firsthand. And I thought that was just a really powerful kind of thing. All right. Next. Okay, so my sister is actually a middle school teacher. She currently teaches special ed. And as you can imagine, she and I have had a lot of conversations about different learning styles and education and just different ways of learning in general and perspectives on the world. Like I mentioned, I had a learning disability growing up. I definitely struggled in K through 12. But my sister was actually kind of the opposite. She always excelled at academics. So we have these really these differing perspectives. But we talk a lot about education, and she knows my love for VR. I mean, I showed her my beehive models and everything. And yeah, we were chatting one day, and we thought like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to actually kind of create some type of prototype for applying VR to a pretty standard lesson. And of course, we thought about the animal cell lesson. It's pretty standard. You kind of think about it like this is of course you're going to choose the cell. But at the same time, I thought that it was actually, because it was kind of an obvious choice, it was kind of a good choice. So my sister sent me some of the lesson plans that she had created and some slide decks and stuff. And I was seeing some of these diagrams, and I just thought to myself, like, these are like the same diagrams that I saw like 18 years ago when I was learning about the cell. And I just thought that was very weird, because I would expect that at this point in time in 2020 we would actually have something a little bit better, maybe higher res at least. But this is abstraction. This is just talking about we're just representing a cell using these little squiggly lines, and we expect kids to know that this squiggly line is different from this squiggly line, and it's different from that squiggly line. And we kind of wonder why kids don't understand the lesson, So I thought that I could probably do better, and so I spent a little bit of time in Oculus Medium. Oh, by the way, just in general, it's hard to find good 3D models for VR, for mobile and everything. So that's why I create a lot of my own assets, just because it takes too much time to edit things. Anyway, that was a tangent, but I just wanted to say it because I felt like it's true. Anyways, I spent a good amount of time in Oculus Medium, kind of making my own model of the cell. And what's interesting about this process is that I learned a lot. I learned not only because I had to research for the cell, I had to research the cell and actually watch like university level videos on the organelles to actually be able to understand the three-dimensional structure. But like I really learned that diagrams are a myth. I mean, I know that this is a diagram. This is obviously not photorealistic because a cell is just like this little blob, and under the microscope, it's not actually very clear. So it's fine. It's fine that this is a diagram. But what I found was that like everything is represented by 2D diagrams. I even saw 2D diagrams represented in 3D, which didn't make any sense to me. So like they were like basically they're saying that organelles were these cross sections, but that's not true. Like a Golgi body kind of looks like it's like the bottom left of the cell here. But like you always see the cross section. And I actually had to do a lot of research and watch a lot of videos and do a lot of learning by myself to actually understand how a cell or how to properly represent the cell. I'll put it that way. But again, I didn't want to be like this little thing that people look at. I didn't even want to be like a basketball size shape. I wanted it to be huge. So on the left, you can actually see that's the size of an avatar. So you can actually fly into the cell, and you can fly through the cell membrane, through the pores, and you can actually see the organelles and the lysosomes and the mitochondria, and you can actually understand the endoplasmic reticulum in 3D, which is really hard to understand in 2D, and that was like probably the hardest part. But you can see how it transitions from the outer to the inner, and then you can see how you can actually go into the nucleus and all that good stuff. But I felt that by making it humongous, you're actually tapping into spatial memory. It's no longer just this diagram that is on a page or even in VR right in front of you, but it was a place. And the idea was that I really wanted to make a place. I really wanted to make the cell a place to be, because I think that that will actually stick with people. Flying, like if you fly through the pore of a cell, I think you're going to remember it. And again, kind of tapping into the feeling aspect as well. This was a very kind of calming, kind of majestic space, and I think that kind of just reinforces the idea of of the whole idea of being in a cell. So yeah, this is just another shot of the cell. Anyways, so that's most of the stuff I have to talk about in terms of more articulated thoughts. But I will just quickly go through some current projects that I'm doing, as well as some upcoming thoughts and experiments that I will be working on. So one of them is meditation. I do a lot of spaces for Evolver. I work very closely with Jeremy on a number of spaces, and you've been to some of these spaces before, but this was the first space I created for him. And I've been thinking a little bit more as far as these meditation spaces. I've been thinking about like memory and emotion and physical sensations and relaxation and breathing and all that stuff. And you could probably expect maybe an article one day about some of these thoughts. But this is like a variation of my Zen space I created for the meditation event. And actually, it's funny. Like Jeremy approached me at first, almost wanting a copy of the Zen space. But my first reaction was like, it feels full after like 8 people, and there's like there's probably going to be 30 people in your event. So again, kind of designing 4 events, I had to really expand it and make it a lot more open, so people didn't feel claustrophobic, and that they could physically or virtually fit in the space. This is a work in progress. This is a exclusive sneak peek. This is a Buddhist temple, Tibetan-style Buddhist temple in the mountains that we're working on. I'm having fun with cloth simulations here, and it's taking forever to render as well, the big lighting. As well as I'm also working on some orb-type stuff in space that will be focused around breathing patterns. But another thing that's really interesting to me is social dynamics. So recently I created a space called the Kiki Lounge, and it's a LGBTQ hangout space. And recently I actually became one of the quote-unquote admins or hosts of the LGBTQ meetup in Altspace along with Chris and many others. But something that's, something that we always have to deal with is trolls, right? An event like this is always going to have trolls. And I've just been thinking about, how can we try to curb some of that? Because I really believe that a space can affect user behavior. And, as a user experience designer, I really think that space and interface and all that stuff can actually influence people. So this is kind of an experiment in just creating a nice space, but making it very clear what the values are in the space. I kind of just want to, actually taking a step back, just to be very open about things. I think when you are different, or if you are LGBTQ, you live in a way where, in most cases, you do feel like an outsider. You don't necessarily feel like you have the power in the room, because most people are probably different from you. But I wanted to create a space where that dynamic is actually turned around, where the space is so gay that you're not going to troll in there because you just feel out of place. So that's hopefully going to be some of the side effects of what I have in the space. But it's an ongoing experiment, so we'll see how it goes. But we're already using it for our Saturday hangout spaces, and so far it's been okay. I think I think people enjoy the space more than they feel like to troll it. So I think hopefully they'll carry over time. So I want to leave everybody with 3 tips that I have for world building. They're pretty simple. But yeah, start with a feeling. I always say that you should pull from some type of memory or feeling or nostalgia or something that ultimately will communicate something to your audience. So you want to make. I think for me the goal is to make someone feel something. If they can feel a feeling, then I think I think that the world is successful. And again, create a place. I think experience is the truest form of storytelling, and designing a space that has a backstory, I think, is pretty important. A space is basically a nonlinear story. It's a character in your nonlinear story in some way. So maybe create some rules for yourself, to kind of help you make it a place rather than just another space. Make sure that everything you put into this space actually plays into this, into a higher level idea, I would say. And lastly, this is kind of just the definition of design in general, but design for a problem. So for my apiary, I purposely wanted to design an event space for that particular event. For the Brooklyn rooftop, I wanted to create a hangout space for adults. For Meme Island, I wanted to create a hangout space for kids. So each one of my worlds, I have a purpose for designing it, and usually that's stated in the form of a problem. So yeah, I've just been talking for pretty much 45 minutes straight, and I just want to quickly shout out that I host the XR Industry Meetup with James, who's in the audience. I believe I have a dash open, so I can't actually see. He may or may not be in the audience. But yeah, the next one is on Saturday from 4 to 5 Eastern. Definitely come and check it out. And I think with that, I will open it to questions. Okay. Whew.
Okay, we are open for questions. If you have a question, click on the raise hand button, your lower right. While we're waiting, I have a question. How long did it take to build the apiary? How many hours did you put into that?
It's hard to say, honestly. Timelines are always hard because I'm usually kind of doing it when I have time. So I don't necessarily keep track of the amount of time I spend. The apiary did not take too long though, because the measurements for beekeeping equipment is pretty much standard. And I had some of those assets actually created I actually created some of those assets years ago in terms of just the bare model. I created a number of years ago probably because I had actually 3D printed models of beehives. So I just kind of took them and repurposed them. And most of the work was actually texturing it, taking those photographs and stuff like that. And then figuring out the structure for the space. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Jim. Jim, I'm giving you the megaphone.
Oh,
If I
thanks.
can. There it
Thank
is.
you. Thanks for your talk, Alan.
Yeah.
One of the challenges I see in VR is that the keyboard really needs to go away. And more specifically, we need an interface that will, since we have, like I'm wearing an Oculus Rift now, and there are Vive where we can see our gestures, we need an interface that reacts more to our gestures and also our voice so we don't have to type. I think that that's pretty much a dead interface in virtual reality. What's your experience with looking at technologies that will do voice to text or that will basically pick up gestures and do away with hand controllers and the like?
Yeah, I mean I'm sure you know this is kind of just a big topic in general that is kind of hard to tackle at the moment. I mean, you can kind of look at it in two ways. One, I mean, like I don't understand why we don't have swipe keyboards in VR. I mean, that would actually make things a lot easier because I can imagine just kind of doing a swipe kind of situation by holding down like the A button or something. But you know, in the grander scheme of things. That's actually really hard to say because you're covering also a lot of topics of accessibility as well. I think it would be great to have text-to-speech. We have that technology. Microsoft has that technology, but they just have to implement it. But then there's a lot of questions also because, I mean, yeah, you're talking about communication, you're talking about data input as well. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of considerations there. I don't have an answer because it's actually one of the big questions I think that we have to figure out as basically an industry at the moment. And even right now, we're kind of going in separate directions because you know the Vive has their own kind of touch controllers. Of course, Oculus is kind of pushing for the addition of hand tracking. So we're still kind of diverging in that way. So, and I don't know if speech is necessarily really the best way to do things at the moment, just because you can think about accessibility. Like maybe not everyone. I mean, just languages and I don't know. Maybe like if you're deaf and maybe you don't use your speech, like what does that look like? And at the same time, if you are deaf, like what does sign language look like given the input devices? I know in VR chat, there's a community of deaf users who have figured out how to create their own version of sign language using different controllers. But yeah, it's a whole Pandora's box, I think, because you're basically asking how do you have input, and I think it's a very intriguing question that I don't have an answer to, but I'm interested to see what happens, I guess. But I think it's still early.
All right, great.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
have another question from Rick.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Let me apologize that my comments or question may be a little maybe naive. I'm really new to all of this. But it's just a follow-up to this past point of discussion. It did seem odd to me very early on in coming into VR through first through the PlayStation VR and then now through the Oculus Quest, that there isn't sort of this virtual keyboard capability. I mean, I cannot touch type. I wish I had learned to touch type, but there are millions and millions of people that do, and it does represent still a very viable means of communicating thoughts and ideas, responses, all of that. And so for the people that touch type, I don't understand why there isn't already this sort of mechanism where your touch typing shows up as a balloon over your virtual head in some way, or is presented in some other means that may be visible to some or all of those engaging in sort of this virtual, dialogue, this conversation. So is it something that I just haven't seen, or are there some works going on to be able to do this? Because I think that sort of dialogue is essential for learning, for communication, and it also brings an accessibility to people utilizing existing skills. It brings them into this VR world. And lastly, I'll say that yes, voice is an important opportunity for us to communicate our ideas or respond to other people, but I do think that the evolution will be is that we will use multiple paths towards communication, not just using our speech, but maybe even texting simultaneously with speaking to someone.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I'll reiterate the point that I made earlier, which is just that I think it's a big question, and I think it is still pretty early. And looking at the industry, we aren't actually even close to settling on any of the solutions. But I think kind of what you just reminded me of is just a more conceptual question of, data input. Very often, you can kind of see it as, in some ways, it's actually like asynchronous communication. And a lot of times, I mean, we look at social VR especially as synchronous communication. So I'm talking to you right now. I'm not typing to you, and you're not reading it. So I mean, although I think it's completely valid, I think it kind of opens up a larger conversation of like, what is the place for synchronous communication and asynchronous communication? So that's one thing that I just kind of thought about. But the other thing is like, if you think about it, also like, I wouldn't be surprised if within a year. Well, I don't know. This is purely speculative, and maybe it doesn't work. But since Oculus it does have the hand tracking, like for people who can touch type, or maybe even people who can't, like what if I could just kind of hold my hands out and pretend I'm typing? And like, do we have algorithms that kind of, and machine learning that can actually understand that, like this finger movement kind of most likely means hello or something, and maybe like mock touch typing is actually kind of like a new kind of motion input for typing. I have no idea. That could be completely not feasible. But again, yeah, I don't know. I think the answer is that, or the non-answer is that we don't really have any answers yet. And I think that is a really big question that the industry in general is trying to figure out right now. But honestly, with the technology that's coming out now, I think the answers are getting are kind of diverging. We're not narrowing it down. We're not kind of narrowing that down yet. So, but I don't know. The conversation is probably even bigger than what I just mentioned. But I think, yeah, I think it's not just you. I think it's a pretty big question.
We have a question from Jim, but I'm having trouble opening his megaphone. And we have a question from Melon. So I'm going to give it to you, Melon.
Have you ever thought about adding food that you can actually eat into some of the VR worlds?
Well, we actually used to have that. Well, I didn't create it, but we used to have some of that. These days, it would be a little bit more of a challenge. Maybe eventually, I'll think about more interactables. But that is something definitely that would be good to have, more interactable things.